How's it going, guys? Brendan here. So I create these weekly news update videos every week because it helps me stay on top of current affairs, and then I share some of the stories with you. If you're new here, first of all, thanks for joining me. And also, I try and target stories that I think are important or interesting and also relate to the overall goal of this channel, which is to help you reach financial independence and give you the option to retire early. And also, make sure you stick around to the end because I always try and add some sort of positive, funny, weird story just to put us off on a good note for the rest of the week. So let's get into it. This past week was another good week for the stock market, with cyclical sectors like financials and industrials outperforming. The S&P 500 also hit a milestone. On Thursday, it briefly topped 3,000 for the first time since February. Also, this is the best two-month performance, April and May, for the S&P 500 since 2009. So how exactly did the financial markets do? Well, the S&P 500 was up 3.2%, Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 3.7%, Russell 2000 was up 2.8%, and the MSCI EAFE was up 5.2%. Now, how have they done year to date? Well, the S&P 500 is now only down 5.8% on the year, Dow Jones is down 11.1% on the year, Russell 2000 is down 16.5% on the year, and the MSCI EAFE is down 14.4% so far. So as states continued to reopen this past week, markets rallied due to optimism around an economic recovery later this year, as well as encouraging news of progress for a virus vaccine. New York, the state hit hardest by the virus, actually reached a new milestone this week, with death and hospitalization rates reaching their lowest levels since the pandemic began. Now, it's not all good news. The US GDP, the global domestic product, is forecast to decline 40% in the second quarter, which would be the worst decline since the Great Depression. While many agree that an economic recovery will take place in the second half of the year, there's much less clarity or agreement on how long it will take to reach those pre-pandemic levels. The magnitude and duration of recessions can vary dramatically. Since this downturn was triggered by a biological crisis rather than a financial crisis, the road to recovery and the timeline will largely depend on the development of vaccines and the treatment of the virus. Some southern states that began reopening early have already seen an increase in infections this week. Now, it was stated that this could also partially be due to an increase in testing, but I think there's little doubt that we will see an increase in the number of infections as states begin to reopen more broadly. And really, I think the next 2 weeks will be very telling on how smoothly this recovery process will go. Last week, there were additional 2.1 million unemployment claims. Now, investors seem reassured that this number continues to trend downward. It's actually decreased every week since it peaked in March 14th. The good news is that the total number of people receiving unemployment benefits actually declined for the first time since February. The number of workers receiving jobless payments for the week ended May 16th was 21.1 million, down 3.9 million from the prior week. The level remains well above the record from before this year, which was 6.5 million in 2009. Now, while the level of claims and the number of workers receiving jobless benefits remains historically high, the numbers actually suggest that many Americans are getting back to work. This suggests that the US labor market is actually at an inflection point, where new layoffs are offset by hiring and recalling of old workers to their old jobs. And in other economic news, consumer spending fell 13.6% in April, which is the steepest decline since records began in 1959. And what I found interesting was actually that income was up 10.5%. They measure income as your wages, your interest, and your dividends. And the biggest story this week is some sad news out of Minneapolis. Earlier in the week, former police officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on the neck of George Floyd, who eventually went limp and ended up passing away later that day. Video of the incident surfaced, leading to outrage for many, and nationwide protests erupted. In some cases, they became violent and led to looting and vandalism and burning of buildings. In one Minneapolis protest, there was actually a police station that was burned. In response, the police officer was charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter on Friday. And on Saturday, several large U.S. cities imposed curfews and activated thousands of National Guard troops. Here's a video showing a glimpse of the riots that have occurred. It's some scary stuff happening right now. In a news conference on Friday, President Trump said the U.S. would end its relationship with the World Health Organization, suspend entry for Chinese foreign nationals who the U.S. views as a security risk, and roll back some of the special preferences granted to Hong Kong after Beijing introduced new national security law on them. President Trump criticized the World Health Organization as being under China's sway and failing to respond adequately to the pandemic. President Trump said the US would redirect the funds it currently sends to the World Health Organization to other deserving, urgent global public health needs because the agency failed to make reform the US had requested. In the housing market, pending home sales posted their largest annual decline ever in April, but it actually appears that the housing market is strengthening. Average home prices in major metropolitan areas across the nation rose 4.4% in the year that ended in March. One potential boost is that mortgage rates hit their lowest levels ever recorded, tracing back almost 50 years. So are any of you working remotely in a different state than your usual one during the pandemic? For example, say your parents live just over the border in one state and you live and work just over the border in a different state, but during the pandemic you decided to move back in with your parents. If so, you may need to file a tax return and potentially pay taxes in each state. Almost all states impose taxes on people who work in their state, even if they're just passing through. For many of them, it's as little as 1 day. The good news is that so far, 13 states and the District of Columbia have agreed not to impose their tax rules on remote workers who are present due to the virus. But more than 24 other states are still set to levy their taxes for 2020. New York has even said that they will impose state taxes on out-of-state healthcare workers who came to the city to help with the pandemic. Here's a graphic showing each state that said they won't tax out-of-state workers. And now for the positive news I promised. And sadly, it's becoming more and more difficult to find these uplifting stories, but I did find a few. So the virus is actually buying us time in our fight against global climate change. Carbon emissions appear to be plateauing, making dire scenarios less likely, but it is estimated that limiting global warming will still require steep emission cuts. But for the first time since 1885, the US actually consumed more renewable energy last year than coal energy. This chart compares the level of energy consumption in the US between coal and renewables. And my last story, on Saturday, SpaceX and NASA successfully launched 2 astronauts into orbit. This marked the first space launch from US soil since 2011 and made SpaceX the first private company to send a human crew into space. The initial attempt on Wednesday was scrubbed due to weather, but clear skies on Saturday enabled the launch to go through. Here's a quick portion of Saturday's launch.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA. Go SpaceX. Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
America has launched. And so rises a new era of American spaceflight, and with it the ambitions of a new generation continuing the dream.
So I think that's good and exciting stuff. Well done. So is there anything I missed in this week's video? What are your concerns about the recovering economy? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe, and hit the little bell icon so you don't miss any future videos. Have a great week. Bye.